Hi everybody, my name is Dennis and welcome back to another album review. For our first album review of 2019, we have the debut project from up-and-coming SoundCloud rapper Arthur Duncan Wood with his project Hollow Shells. Now, with SoundCloud, the main thing I really look for going into a record is something that's interesting, unique, something that they're either doing differently than everyone else or better than the people who are doing something similar. And for the most part, I think Arthur has interesting enough production and vocal range that he does stand out as different. Even though I do think his voice may be a bit of an acquired taste, I can see a lot of people hearing them be like, oh man, he doesn't have a good voice, why would you listen to this? But I do think there's an interesting uniqueness to it. And I don't think it's all that grating. If anything, that was one of the highlights of this album, was just how unique I find his voice. And there are some structural errors with this album, especially for it having 10 tracks and really only 6 of them being fully fleshed out songs, because you have an intro track and then you have 3 things that sound more like interludes, with those being Mangroves, New Birds, Full Moon, and Apes Augmented. And even though these may not all have bad sounds, especially New Birds, Full Moon has a really interesting, beautifully haunting and creepy aesthetic to it that I really enjoyed. I do think that for having this many interlude-esque tracks, this album would have needed to be significantly longer than it is. I don't believe it even reaches the half-hour mark, which makes a lot of these interludes feel a bit out of place, if anything. And especially when they don't always, at least from what I could understand, contribute to the concept going through this, with a lot of it seeming like technology has developed to the point of no turning back, and it's destroying humanity, and you have Arthur Duncan Wood here trying to escape from it, and we see him running to his Uncle Henry in the song Uncle Henry for help so they can sail away, and they end up in a forest just trying to escape. And from what I can understand, the song 46 Kill AK D.VA almost seems like they were captured, and we have this very almost sounds like a serial number type of a thing, with gunshots going on in the background, seeming like the violence that has ensued because of this overcoming technology. And I do think that this concept could work, but I do think there were some issues with the lyrics that just don't give a purpose behind this message. I mean, the closest we get to that is on Apes Augmented, where he talks about Instagram, Snapchat filters, and it's like almost distracting to us. And even though this may be true that it's distracting us from more important things, it's taking over our lives to an extent, I do think there could have been a much better job developing a reason behind this. Why are you telling us this? What do you have to say to this very saturated topic of discussion? I mean, a lot of people have a lot of strong viewpoints and some really interesting thought processes going into this. And that's one thing that I think more could have been brought to the table lyrics-wise. But I do think the production was pretty solid throughout. I mean, the song Uncle Henry was a pretty solid one. I thought the beat to it was nice. I thought his flow going over it did fairly well. I can't quite say the same for the Underground Railroad, though. I do think the very almost like a horn or a trumpet type sound going into it throughout the beat doesn't mesh well with the flow of his voice. I think they travel at very different pacings, and they don't mesh well together. They almost seem like they're conflicting for a spotlight. I do think this song, An Open Letter to Elon Musk, I think it had a very cheery beat, very upbeat, but still somewhat of a distant sound that I think works well for the song. And the song Anomennomorr, I believe I pronounced that right. I enjoyed this song as well. It had, again, one of those more creepy, disturbing aesthetics that I think he actually portrays very well. I think his flow was also very good for that one. I actually didn't care too much for the song Hollow Shells, and that's because the beat to this, even though it's not necessarily bad, sounds exactly what I would expect from an average person I just find randomly on SoundCloud. And that's probably the worst crime you can commit on a SoundCloud record, is just sounding like everybody else, because this is something where there are so many people, you need to be different. And when you have a song like Hollow Shells that does absolutely nothing different or interesting, I think the beat is very typical of SoundCloud. You can easily hear that and be like, oh, that sounds like something you just hear on SoundCloud, like you've probably heard from hundreds of other artists on the platform. And it just fails to interest me because of how generic it sounds. But I do think the standout track on here was probably the song 46 Kill aka D.VA. And this one had a very heavy, aggressive beat with a very powerful flow that I don't quite see throughout the rest of this album. And even though you can argue it sounds a bit more like typical SoundCloud, I do think that this does it better. And like I said before, even if you're not 100% different, if you can do something better, that's just as good. And I think he does this better than average. I thought it was a very good track. It was definitely the standout track on the album, and one that I enjoyed listening to a lot. It was a solid closing track, and even though it may not sound like your typical closing track to an album, it was a really enjoyable song. And I'd like to hear more things like this coming from Arthur Duncan Wood in the future. So with that being said, there are some flaws structurally and lyrically throughout this album, and a couple of weak tracks here and there, but all in all, Arthur Duncan Wood does a pretty good job of making himself stand out. I do think there is a lot of room for improvement, but he's someone that I could see doing something great. So that being said, I'm feeling a light 6 on this album. Be sure to check it out. It is out on Tidal right now exclusively, but the full release will be coming out January 14th on all platforms, so be sure to look for it, and I will see you in the next review.